Obrigado. Merci. Wonderful to be here again. I love prizes. Prizes are wonderful. A luxurious, fun-filled, all-expense-paid holiday for two in romantic Mazatlan, Mexico. A lazy boy luxury lift power recliner with 6 motor massage and eat. Come on down. A Lincoln Navigator 4x2, sticker price $59,062. Wheel of Fortune. A Dicker and Dicker of Beverly Hills cuffed black sheared mink jacket with chinchilla collar. A year's supply of rice aroni, a San Francisco treat. Come on down. Of course, game show prizes are rather randomly given, unlike literary prizes. It's not widely known, and they're never formally listed among the judges, but for the past 40 years or so, the final arbiters of most American poetry prizes, most especially the poetry prizes, have been, and this may come as something of a surprise, Cheech and Chong. With the exception of 2003, when Tommy Chong was serving a jail sentence. I would be interested in going back and finding out who won the prizes in 2003. You all, well, don't turn on the gizmos now, but you can check later. Which is why 90% of the time, American people chosen for American Poetry Awards and the prizes themselves are so unaccountably bizarre. But we Americans are a whimsical people, and so our prizes are whimsically chosen. Not so here in Canada. The Canadian is a more virtuous, fair-minded, and enlightened sort. I know this to be true because I have been continuously reminded of the fact for the past 45 years by my Canadian friends. When I was an undergraduate here in Canada in the early 1970s, I had a professor in a course on the modern British novel I shall hereinafter refer to as Professor Ponce. Professor Ponce had won a prize, a Canadian first novel prize in 1964, an extraordinarily bad novel, followed by 2 novels not nearly up to the standard of the first. But it was not the prize he was most proud of. What he was most proud of was an article he published in 1952, A New Interpretation of the Wasteland, which strongly suggested that T.S. Eliot was a homosexual. What shall we think of Mr. Eliot's sexual inclinations? Do we really want to speculate about T.S. Eliot's sex life? Frank Sinatra's? Maybe. T.S. Eliot's? I don't think so. Regardless, Eliot was not pleased with this interpretation and set loose his solicitors on the journal in which the offending article appeared, effectively suppressing it. What could be more thrilling for a mediocre novelist than to piss off a great poet? One afternoon, Professor Ponce began his class by lifting his poncy right foot and positioning it jauntily on a nearby chair, then lighting his poncy pipe, as was his custom, before the formal bloviating commenced. And in that plummy poncy tone of his, a mixture of his native South Africa and Cambridge University, announcing apropos of nothing seemingly at hand that the finest fiction writer in Canada and very possibly the finest writer of fiction in English at this moment in time was a local woman who worked in a bookstore downtown. I figured out almost immediately that he was probably talking about Mrs. Monroe, the wife of the proprietor of Monroe's bookstore. Victoria was not a large place. Also, I was very keenly aware of Mrs. Monroe because I spent a fair bit of time in the bookstore, and she was an extremely attractive woman, even to a very young man, 20 years her junior. In those days, she had an intense, preoccupied way about her. One would have thought twice about asking her if a certain book was in stock, which is not necessarily a quality you would want in a bookstore employee. But of one thing I was certain, her curves and mane of dark hair notwithstanding, she almost certainly couldn't be any good at all. So who was the fool? I ask it. There was much pride in Canada and among Canadian women that Miss Monroe won the Nobel Prize. Being neither Canadian nor female, I couldn't care less if the new laureate was a tranny from Transylvania. But her choice was an excellent and exciting one, not because of her gender and nationality, but because of her art, most especially the art of the short story, which is the superior form to the novel, because in its economy and architecture, it more closely resembles the poem. Is there any writer of fiction today whose work comes closer to poetry than the Irish short story writer Claire Keegan at her best? Let's give her a Nobel, too. It is a laborious madness and an impoverishing one, wrote Jorge Luis Borges. The madness of composing vast books, setting out in 500 pages an idea that can be perfectly related orally in 5 minutes. The better way to go about it is to pretend that these books already exist. A small liberal arts college in Southern California I taught at last fall advertised recently for a new position in the literature department, teaching a survey of the modern British novel. Professor Ponce, sadly, is no longer with us, so that was not a possibility. But some 850 other prospective scholars applied for the position, and in over 800 of the applications, describing why they would be most suitable for the job, made a point of dropping the words gender and ethnicity in the first paragraph. Of course, they knew what they were doing and had been trained to do exactly this. In not 20 of the applications did the word art appear. As worthy a choice as Alice Munro was, the prize just as deservedly could have been awarded to Margaret Atwood or the recently deceased Mavis Gallant. Isn't it extraordinary that a country of Canada's population has 3 women deserving of such an honor? I knew you'd clap for that. Furthermore, the prize could just as fairly been awarded, in my humble opinion, to 2 Canadian poets on hand this evening, Anne Carson and Robert Bringhurst. I hate to admit it, we poets are not generous souls, but they are really very good. That makes 5 Canadians at the very least, whom I regard as Nobel worthy. Does the United States, with 10 times the population, have that many? Was Miss Gallant, though, truly Canadian, living in Paris for 60 years? Was 1950s Quebec not stimulating enough for her? Is Bringhurst really Canadian? LA, MIT, University of Utah and Indiana, the Army Intelligence and the Sinai. What's that about? And Anne Carson, where the hell does she hang her hat at the end of the day? Not Shabugamoo, I can tell you. And should the Nobel Committee take into consideration Anne and Robert's work as translators, Bringhurst's work on the Haida and his now classic work on typefaces. Or Carson the essayist, whose Eros the Bittersweet, her book-length essay, is one of the most extraordinary essays of its kind in English. In other words, the full range of their literary enterprises. Are the Swedes permitted to consider such things? I put the question out there. Is there a Swede here in attendance tonight who may tell us? If so, please bring this notion back to your people on the Gulf of Bothnia. Many here this evening, most, may well disagree with me, pillory me if you will. Probably many will not remember. But by my lights, a pall descended upon Canada in the 1970s, a chauvinistic protectionist pall, which sat no more densely anywhere on the ground than here in Toronto. No applause that time. Foreign invitees to the Harborfront reading series would comment about it. They really would, repeatedly. There are many sound, irrefutable arguments to be made for nurturing and protecting organizations like the estimable Canadian Film Board, among others, and in general, putting a serious filter in place to mitigate the avalanche of toxic slop from your neighbor to the south. Canadian identity, English and French, was under assault, no question, and remains so today. But there were not a few insidious side effects. Something of a siege mentality set in, with an attendant cultural insecurity that took a lot of oxygen and possibility away from the Canadian arts, and drove, I think, the country inward and probably some of its most gifted away. If, as Samuel Johnson noted, patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, what should we make of cultural patriots? And there were those who took advantage. Inevitably, I suppose, as always seems to be the case, one has to deal with any number of clever, not very talented operators who are prepared to game the system and feather their own nests at the expense of those more worthy. We certainly have that type in the United States, insinuating their way onto committees and panels, trading favors like the most abject politicians. Their names resurface time and again. It's not merely unseemly. They do real damage. The arts, like sport, are unfair. It's not fair, for instance, that the Irish produce so many gifted writers. On the other hand, they tend not to be able to jump very high or compose memorable symphonic music. In my personal view, a first-rate artist doesn't need any handicap or special dispensation. He or she just needs to be watered now and then, encouraged, or at least not discouraged, and have the work left out into the open air to flourish. We can all do a better job, by which I mean we can all be more vigilant, less timid, and predictable at spotting and rewarding original and serious talent. Canada is a far more confident country now, culturally, than it was 40 years ago. And I really can't think of any single entity or organization that helped internationalize at least the literary end of the culture than the Griffin Trust. And I'm not just buttering up the guy who buttered our toast this evening. This is the real deal. The Griffin Trust has not only forced, or at least teased, the windows open and let the fresh air blow both in and out. It has served to showcase Canadian letters while at the same time highlighting Toronto's centrality and importance in the larger literary world. It hath been otherwise. This room is filled with excellence this evening, both domestic and international. And in a moment, I will raise a toast, especially to the poets singled out for their achievement this evening. And whether it's a Pinot from the Niagara Peninsula or something imported. Of one thing I'm certain, having been to a couple of these Griffin ceremonies before, like everything else, it will be quite delicious. Thank you very much.